There are moments in history when a single voice cuts through the noise and leaves the world in silence. Today, you will hear about one such moment. A man who dared to imagine what no one else would and spoke what no one else could. His name, Jaishankar, and his words, well, they just might change the way you see power forever. Silence is the loudest applause. When Jaishankar stood before the world that day, there was no cheering crowd, no deafening ovation, no thunder of hands clapping in agreement. There was only a stillness, a quiet so thick it almost hummed, and yet it was louder than any stadium roar, because in that silence lay recognition of a man who dared to say what no one else would, a man who broke the comfortable lies and spoke the dangerous truth, a man who broke the comfortable lies and spoke the dangerous truth. That silence was not weakness. That silence was not indifference. That silence was respect. Every great speaker, every great leader eventually learns that applause is not the true measure of their words. Applause is easy, it's predictable, it's polite. People clap even when they don't understand. They clap even when they disagree. It's a reflex of the crowd, not a reflection of the soul. But silence cannot be faked. Silence comes only when the words are too heavy to answer, when the truth sinks so deep into a person's chest they forget to breathe. When you've struck the nerve so raw and so real that no one dares to move, you know you've spoken something that matters. Jaishankar chose his words carefully, as he always does, calm, measured, and yet sharp enough to cut through the smugness of those who thought they owned the narrative. He didn't shout. He didn't pound his fist on the table. He didn't need to. He simply laid bare what everyone else was too afraid to even imagine saying. He told the world in no uncertain terms that India would no longer play the game by rules written elsewhere, that India would speak in its own voice, on its own terms, without apology. And the room went silent. You could see it on their faces. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, as though his words had forced them to confront something ugly in themselves. Some avoided his eyes, afraid that his calm gaze might see through their carefully constructed masks. Some sat frozen, trapped between anger and admiration, unsure which one they felt more. But no one, not a single soul, dared to interrupt him. No one dared to clap just to fill the space, because they all knew clapping would cheapen what had just happened. And that's the power of silence as applause. It doesn't come from courtesy, it comes from awe, from fear even. It's the sound of people realizing they've just witnessed something they can't unhear, something that will echo in their minds long after the moment has passed, something they'll carry with them quietly, even if they never speak of it aloud. Silence is not emptiness. It is not absence. Silence is full of all the things people wish they could say back, but can't find the words for, full of all the defenses they built around themselves, now crumbling, full of all the realizations they're too proud or too ashamed to show. Silence is the truest applause because it comes not from the hands, but from the heart. When Jaishankar finished, he didn't smile. He didn't wait for validation. He didn't even seem to notice the stillness that hung over the room. He simply gathered his papers and left the podium, leaving everyone else to sit in the thick, heavy quiet he had created. He knew what that silence meant. He didn't need it spelled out for him. Because a man who has mastered silence does not need noise to know he has been heard. It's easy to impress a room. It's easy to say what they expect you to say and collect your applause. But to leave them silent Truly silent takes something more. It takes truth, it takes courage, it takes imagination, and above all, it takes the willingness to stand alone in that quiet, to resist the urge to fill it with hollow words or nervous laughter, and to trust that those who heard you will never forget what you said. In that moment, the silence was not just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something greater. It was the presence of realization, the presence of discomfort, the presence of a new reality sinking into their bone. And that is the kind of applause every leader should strive for. Not the fleeting clatter of hands, but the silence that stays. Courage begins where permission ends. There comes a point in every man's journey when the rules no longer apply, when the polite nod of approval from others feels hollow and the boundaries drawn around him feel too small to hold what he truly is. That is the moment when permission ends. And that is precisely where courage begins. On that day, as Jaishankar stood before the world, he was not a man seeking validation. He was not a diplomat waiting to be told what was acceptable to say. He was not there to color inside the lines someone else had drawn for him. He was there to tell the truth as he saw it, no matter how many found it uncomfortable, no matter how many wished he would keep quiet, because courage does not ask for permission. Courage does not wait for an invitation. Courage does not knock politely on the door and hope someone lets it in. Courage kicks the door open and walks in anyway. Courage kicks the door open and walks in anyway. In the eyes of the powerful men and women seated before him, you could see the expectation that he would play the game as it had always been played, that he would bow to the unspoken hierarchy, that he would frame his words within the narrow cage of what was deemed acceptable. But what they forgot was that India's story was no longer one of waiting in line, and Jaishankar, standing there, made that clear. It is easy to stay within the boundaries. It is easy to ask for permission, to wait for someone else to tell you it's your turn, to wait until they tell you it's safe. It feels secure, it feels comfortable, and it feels proper. But nothing worth doing has ever been born from comfort. Nothing worth saying has ever been spoken from inside the lines. Every great leap forward, every great stand in history, every voice that ever changed the world began at the exact same place, the moment permission ended. He didn't ask if they were ready to hear what he had to say. He didn't ask if it would upset the balance of the room. He didn't soften his words to make them easier to swallow. Instead, he spoke plainly, he spoke boldly, and he spoke truths that some of them had worked their whole lives to avoid confronting. In that instant, you could feel the air shift. The polite smiles froze on their lips. The mask of superiority cracked just enough to reveal the fear underneath, because nothing frightens those who hold power more than someone who refuses to ask for it. And so, living with it is painful. It's often, courage is lonely. It always has been. It means stepping forward when no one else will. It means being the first to speak when everyone else is silent. It means carrying the weight of disapproval, of anger, of resistance, and standing tall anyway. Courage is not loud. Courage is not reckless. It is calm, it is steady, and it is unyielding, because it knows the truth that you will never change the world if you are waiting for the world to tell you it's okay to try. Permission is a leash, and too many never realize it's been around their necks their whole lives. They mistake it for respect, for order, for belonging. But Jaishankar knew better. He knew that every second you spend waiting for permission is a second you give away your own power. And he was not about to give his away to anyone. In the silence that followed his words, you could almost hear the grinding of teeth. You could almost feel the unease settle into their bones. He had crossed the invisible line they thought no one would ever dare to cross. And once it's crossed, it can never be drawn again. That is the gift of courage and the curse of permission. For every person sitting in that room who wished he'd stayed quiet, there was another, maybe silently, maybe secretly, who felt something awaken in them, a recognition, a realization that they too had been waiting too long, that they too had been asking for something they never really needed. And in that instant, courage became contagious, because it always does. Courage begins where permission ends. And once it begins, there's no stopping it. Imagination is a weapon, not a luxury. For far too long, people have treated imagination as though it were an ornament, something pretty to have, something soft and harmless, something you indulge in only when the serious business is done. They speak of it as if it were a child's plaything, as if it belonged only to artists and dreamers, a luxury you can afford only when the real work is over. But the truth is far sharper, far darker, far more dangerous than that. Imagination is not a pastime. It is not a distraction. It is a weapon, and the most underestimated one of all. That day when Jaishankar took the podium, he did not simply speak about what was. He spoke about what could be. He painted a picture of a future no one else dared to imagine. Because imagination in the hands of the courageous cuts deeper than any blade. It shows people what they didn't want to see. It forces the powerful to confront what they fear most, that the world they built can be undone by nothing more than an idea. Imagination is what separates the leader from the follower, the revolutionary from the subject, the free man from the slave. Because the man who cannot imagine a world beyond his chains will never break them. But the man who can, he becomes dangerous. He becomes unpredictable. He becomes unstoppable. And that's why those who sit atop the old order always try to kill imagination first. They call it foolish. They call it reckless. They call it impossible. Because they know better than anyone that nothing is more powerful than someone who can see beyond what is and dares to make it real. When Jaishankar spoke of India's role in the world, he didn't just repeat what others wanted to hear. He spoke of a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new balance of power that no one else dared to picture out loud. In that moment, his words were not just arguments, they were weapons. Because imagination, wielded by the brave, does not just describe reality, it reshapes it. And that is why imagination frightens people, because it is unpredictable, because it is unruly, because it slips through the cracks of the strongest walls and takes root in the minds of even the most loyal subjects. You cannot control imagination. You cannot outlaw it. You cannot bomb it into submission. All you can do is try to convince people it doesn't matter, that it is just a luxury, a hobby, a child's toy. But imagination has toppled empires, it has shattered chains, it has overthrown tyrants. Every revolution ever born, every new nation ever dreamed into being, every movement that ever changed the course of history began first not with armies, but with a vision. One person's ability to see what others refuse to see and to believe it into being. And when Jaishankar spoke, he reminded everyone in that room and beyond that the most dangerous weapon a man can carry is not in his hands, but in his mind. That you can silence his voice, you can try to break his body, but you cannot kill the world he imagines unless you dare to imagine something greater yourself. Imagination is not a comfort. It is not gentle. It is not safe. It is dangerous. It is sharp. It is a threat to everything that is comfortable, to everything that has been decided, to everything that clings to power. It is the one thing you cannot regulate or contain. Because once a man sees a better world in his mind, you cannot convince him to go back to sleep. That is why the ones who imagine are feared. Not because they dream, but because they act on those dreams. Because they see possibilities that others deny and have the courage to make them real. Imagination is not for the faint of heart. It is not for those who wish to fit neatly into the stories they've been told. It is for those who wish to write their own. And when you understand this, when you stop treating imagination as some luxury reserved for poets and painters, when you finally recognize it for what it truly is, a weapon, you begin to understand why it is so carefully discouraged, so often ridiculed, so bitterly fought against. Those who wield imagination well can bring nations to their knees. Those who wield it well can build worlds no one else could even see coming. That day, Jaishankar showed the world that imagination in the hands of the fearless is more powerful than any army they could ever muster against him. Because imagination is not just what we see when we close our eyes. It is what opens them. History remembers those who dared to disrupt. When you look back at the long, winding road of human progress, you will not find the names of the timid engraved in its stones. You will not find the ones who quietly obeyed, who kept their heads down, who played their small parts in someone else's story. History does not remember the obedient. History remembers the disruptors, the ones who refused to play by the rules, who shattered the comfortable illusions of their time, who dared to speak when silence was safe, who dared to move when standing still was expected. That day, as Jaishankar stood in the glare of the world's scrutiny, he knew the cost of disruption. He knew it would unsettle the room, anger the powerful, invite resistance, draw fire. And still he chose to speak. Still he chose to disrupt. Because he knew what too many forget, that nothing changes until someone is brave enough to break what no longer serves. Disruption is not a reckless act. It is not noise for the sake of noise. It is not rebellion without reason. True disruption is deliberate, it is measured, it is born from the clarity of seeing a lie that others have learned to live with and deciding you will no longer live with it yourself. It takes vision to see the cracks and courage to press your fingers into them until the whole facade comes crashing down. Jaishankar stood in a room full of people who believed they already understood the world, who believed the map of power was permanent and unchanging. They thought they knew where India belonged in that map. They thought they knew what was allowed to be said and what was not. And then, in a voice that was steady and sure, he drew a new map. He disrupted the story they told themselves about how the world worked and left them staring at it in silence. Disruptors are always met with resistance. That is the nature of their work. Because every system, no matter how unjust, no matter how fragile, no matter how outdated, wants to protect itself. People cling to what they know, even when it hurts them, because what they know feels safer than the unknown. And that is why so many stay silent, That is why so many keep their heads down, but history does not remember them. History remembers the ones who stood when standing was dangerous, the ones who spoke when speaking was costly, the ones who moved when the rest stayed still. Disruption is not easy. It makes enemies. It invites scrutiny. It leaves scars, but it also leaves something greater. It leaves a mark. Every great change in history was born from disruption. The end of empires, the rise of nations, the fall of tyrants, the birth of rights we now take for granted. Every one of these moments began with someone who dared to say no more, someone who dared to imagine a different way, and then refused to apologize for it. Jaishankar did not disrupt for the sake of ego. He did not disrupt to make noise. He disrupted because he saw a truth no one else wanted to say out loud. And he understood that leaving it unsaid would have been a greater betrayal than anything his critics could accuse him of. And in that moment, he chose to carry the weight of that choice, because that is what leaders do. It is always easier to keep things as they are, to play along, to avoid making waves. But the ones who make history are never the ones who stayed safe. They are the ones who chose risk over comfort, truth over popularity, courage over compliance. Jaishankar's words that day rippled through that room like a stone thrown into still water. And even as the ripples met resistance, even as they collided with walls, they could not be taken back. The disruption had already begun. And though the room fell silent, history was already listening. Those who disrupt rarely get thanks in their time, but they are remembered long after those who stood against them are forgotten. Because disruption is not about being liked. It is about being right when it matters most. It is about being brave enough to change the course of the river, even when the current fights against you. It is about being willing to lose today in order to win tomorrow. History does not remember the quiet. History does not remember the compliant. History remembers those who dare to disrupt, and in doing so, gave the rest of us permission to imagine something greater. History does not remember the quiet. History does not remember the compliant.